Alright, let's get started with the first conversation today. And as I mentioned, this specifically relates to real estate and residential real estate. Assume you're out looking for a house. You found a great property in a locality that you like, and this assume is either in Mumbai or in the National Capital Region. There's an assumption that you make here. You assume that when you're buying the property, you own the rights to the land as well. But that's not necessarily the case. In fact, specifically, that isn't the case when the land that you're buying the property on is a leasehold land. What is a leasehold property? How is it different from freehold? And what are the factors that you should bear in mind when you should consider buying one? And those are some of the facts that we're going to be talking about today. My guest is Gaurav Kumar, who is the Managing Director and Co-Head of Capital Markets at CBRE India. Thank you so much, Gaurav, for joining in. I want to start with the most basic question. I must admit that I was not familiar with leasehold properties, so I will ask, what is the basic difference between leasehold and freehold, and what are the first few factors that one has to bear in mind?
Hi, Alex. The concept of leasehold land basically is to give control to the original owner, who becomes the lessor. And it is designed to put restrictive covenants on the person to whom the land is being given. The genesis of this is that land has always been a source of revenue for the state, for the government. Even if you go back into the pre-independence era, what they used to call then as the Lagan, or the revenue that comes from the land, was essentially a way for the administration to earn recurring income. And that's why there was a hesitancy in selling the lands on a freehold basis. And that's really the genesis of leasehold lands in India, and I'm guessing in most parts of the world. But as time has gone along, this, as we know, has given rise to a whole host of issues, because as the leases expire, just renewal of those leases, and I know you're based in Bombay, and it's a very controversial subject there. But going back to your original question, the concept of leasehold land is it puts restrictions on further selling of those lands. If you want to mortgage the land, you need basically NOCs from the original owner and the lessor. And since land is a state subject, every city or every state has different nuances. Delhi and Mumbai, I guess, have suffered the most on account of leasehold lands. That's why it gives rise to all the issues that we speak about.
Okay. Now, I have come across, once I started reading about these leasehold properties, generally you have a categorization, right, Gaurav? It's called B1 properties, which are collector passing properties, as they call it. And the leases differentiate, or rather there are different leases. A lot of them, I think, have 99-year leases, but there are few that I've come across, there are 999-year leases as well. Is there a uniformity? How does one understand these?
So B1 or Class 2 lands is very specific only to collector lands in Mumbai. And I guess the reason why they're very relevant is because the collector lands were sold to housing societies many years back. And there are a few housing societies in Mumbai, many of which are coming close to the end of their tenure for leasehold land. Now, obviously, common sense dictates that if you have a 999-year lease vis-a-vis a 99-year lease, clearly the former is better than the latter, right? Because having a 1,000-year lease is a perpetual ownership of that asset. Whereas if you have a 99-year lease land, then you know that as this property passes through generations, at some stage it will lose value, because the value is only equal to what your residual lease period is, which is what is causing all the complications. So clearly, if you're a buyer and if you're differentiating between, what kind of leasehold land it is as far as tenure is concerned, the longer the better. 999, no problems at all. If it's a 99, many cases it's 60, many cases it's 30. That's when clearly there has to be a reflection of that in the value of the property or the value of the apartment that you buy.
Okay. I also want to understand this from the perspective of what happens. Now, you mentioned 99, 60, 30. what happens when you draw to the close of this lease period? You have to renegotiate the lease, you have to sign another lease. Is that basically what works? Is it that simple?
So because many of these leases were signed or allotted many years back, and like I said, the whole design or the whole intention was for the owner, which in many cases is the state or the government, was for them to earn a source of revenue recurring through a land rent, which is very minimal. But also at the expiry, you need to go back to the owner, which, as you spoke about in the case of the collector land, you need to go back to the collector to get an NOC. And as they've been trying to institutionalize the resale process or the redevelopment process for leasehold lands on expiry, what's happened is that the amount that you need to pay for that NOC, which is a percentage of the ready reckoner value in the case of Bombay, if it's 15% for residential properties, because ready reckoner rates have also kept pace largely with market values, that amount suddenly becomes a very big number for a set of residents to pay for a renewal of that lease. So the lease in most cases define that at the expiry, you need to pay something called as an unearned increase in the intrinsic value of the property to the owner of the property on renewal. And that's where the entire issue is. So in most cases, you have lessees going to courts, which is why if you see whether it's collector land or Mumbai Port Trust land, or in Delhi, many cases with NDMC land, lessees have gone knocking to the court saying we've invested a lot of money in these properties, and in many cases, for example, in Maharashtra, they can take refuge under the Maharashtra Rent Control Act, especially in the case of the MPT, the Mumbai Port Trust issue, saying that, look, we should be granted the status of tenants. Now, to give the state and the government full credit, originally, again, coming back to collector land was many times given at concessional rates to housing societies, which is a fact that is mostly ignored. So the government's contention is that, look, this was a public asset. We gave it for a good cause at a concessional rate. So now you have to pay up on the expiry. But, rarely does that happen. These matters end up in courts and it becomes very, very messy, which is why it's a very good idea to avoid any lands on which the lease, residual lease, is very, very limited.
Okay, that's a fair point. Now, I want to get into the modalities of this. Assume, and quite a few of these properties, Gaurav, are in areas that are quite good. In fact, the buildings also are quite good. Of course, in several cases, and you mentioned this, the properties do tend to get dilapidated because necessarily the residents are not capable of paying that fee, and we'll come to that in just a bit. But assume that the property is good, structurally sound, and there's a potential buyer that needs to look at this. What are the factors that they need to bear in mind? Would it normally be assumed that such a property would be at a lesser value compared to freehold properties in the same area?
Absolutely. If you're buying an apartment in a condo where your residual lease is only 20 years or 30 years, right, you would have to factor that in. You're basically buying it for yourself and not for the next generation. Yes, there is a speculative element involved there that, look, after 20 or 30 years, you'll either go to court or you'll try and, negotiate your way through a renegotiation, or maybe market values will go up considerably. But, technically speaking, you're buying a property which has a life of 20 years, even if it's in great shape and form. Clearly, that has to be reflected in the value of the property. Absolutely. In Delhi, you have the case of LNDO land, which was all allotted as leasehold land, but since they were sold to individual owners, and also the Delhi government's norms for renewal or conversion from leasehold to freehold was relatively much less expensive. So as an owner of a plot or a bungalow in Delhi, if I wanted to convert it from leasehold to freehold, it didn't cost me as much money. I was the only decision maker, and I still had great market value despite me deducting a little bit for that conversion from leasehold to freehold, right? So that's it's a great case study of how it can be done in a rational and an easy way. In the case of Mumbai, the many points of view emerge that, look, it costs crores for residents to go back and get an NOC or to renew that lease, and therefore it becomes unviable. And I want to repeat the point that I said earlier to give the state full credit. They say that, look, we had given this land at concessional rates. So, there are both points of view that are equally valid.
Fair enough. I do want to come to one more point before I ask you for your overall view when you compare leasehold versus freehold, and that is the conversion that you just mentioned. Assuming that there are, to be changes made, and I understand that the current government is also in talks, assuming that it gets easy, would it then make sense or more sense than it does right now to enter some of these properties, because then the conversion rate would be at a much smaller fraction of the ready reckoner rate and therefore might just be a little bit more affordable?
If you are a user and you're buying an asset or buying an asset for the long term, then first priority should be either new leases, freehold land, or if you really love a project, or if there is an imperative for you to be in a particular project where the residual lease is very short, then you need to factor in that into your pricing. Like I said earlier, the renewal of these leases in most cases in Mumbai is expensive, as people have found out. Even at a 15% of ready reckoner value, it's very expensive. And that tenure is also coming to an end. So at some stage, it could even become 50. And I know there's a lot of discussion and a lot of debate going on. Maybe it doesn't end up happening. But even at a base value of 15% of ready reckoner value, the renewal premium is considerable and significant. And what it does, it just adds a lot of uncertainty. If you're a resident or if you're an owner, why would you enter into a property at this stage, when you can see clearly that in a few years, whether it's 5 or 10 or 15 years, in real estate, you don't buy for a 5-year time horizon, right? You buy it for a 50 or a 75-year time horizon, something that your future generations can enjoy. So very, very tricky. I mean, one should be careful in entering such assets.
And also, of course, in certain cases, there are rules set by societies that buy these lands, then that further lease on to other people who buy, that become a little bit difficult to hold out on with regard to the selling to a certain type of person. But beyond that, okay, let's talk about the final clincher, right? If someone was to come to you for advice, Gaurav, and was to say that between a property that, say, is freehold and available at maybe a markup of 20-30% and
I would let other factors come into play, like location or the quality of the asset that you're buying into, or the quality of your particular unit, apartment or floor or condo that you're buying into. If it's leasehold around 60 years, it needs to incorporate a price discount for sure, 60 or less, as far as resi property is concerned. If it's 99 years and it's 99 years left, then you can take a philosophical call and say, look, at least 3 or 4 generations are going to enjoy this asset. But, we are all a little spoiled with the amount of knowledge that we have, and sometimes ignorance is bliss. But with that caveat, personally, I would always want to buy freehold. But in many cases, there are great projects in great locations. If it's a long enough lease, I think it should be all right.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for joining in. I'm sure that your perspective will be useful to a lot of people that are in the market right now for real estate. As we're hearing, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that suggests that it is heating up the real estate market. Thank you so much once again, Gaurav, for taking the time.
Thanks, Alex.
All right, on that note, we're slipping into a short break on this program, but there's more on the other side, so do stay tuned.